Our planet faces an unprecedented health, social, and economic crisis, one that puts every nation on Earth in danger and challenges all fundamental assumptions about our world. The COVID-19 pandemic threatens to reverse decades of development progress, putting the Sustainable Development Goals at risk. It has brutally exposed the vulnerability of developing countries and magnified the inequality that exists both within and between nations. This is the first opportunity since the pandemic began for world leaders to come together and create global solutions for trade and development. The almost 200 countries represented here have a unique opportunity to do things differently, to do things better, to make sure global trade benefits everybody equally. This is our opportunity to forge a shared destiny between developing countries and developed ones, to use technology to create better productive systems, to cut carbon emissions and give our planet another chance, to put in place effective financing for development and establish a sustainable global debt system. We have the potential to give everybody the opportunity to succeed by bridging the digital divide, improving gender equality, boosting productive capacities, and investing in our youth. UNCTAD 15 is a moment for us all to act together, to employ bold new thinking to help address the biggest challenges that face the world. Together, let's create a more equitable and prosperous future for everyone. Together, let's move from inequality and vulnerability to a future of prosperity for all. Because now, more than ever before, trade needs to work for everybody.
We have all seen the stark differences in how countries and individuals have managed to cope during the pandemic. So what are the implications for the future? The focus of our second dialogue is a dialogue on equality. Is the COVID-19 pandemic really a game changer? I hand over to my colleague in Geneva, Peter Kwache, to get the conversation started. Peter?
Very good morning to you out there in Barbados. These distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, thanks again for joining us here at the World Leaders Summit Dialogue 2. As Sharon said, this dialogue is inequality. Is COVID-19 crisis really a game changer? Now, as we all know, COVID-19 is a global crisis, yet there are substantial asymmetrics in how it impacts people and economies and their ability to respond. We have observed that mainly developed countries have the fiscal space for support and recovery measures, as well as the financial power to access vaccines for their populations. However, many developing countries cannot afford large-scale support measures nor vaccines. This has increased a sense of injustice and threatens global development. So this dialogue will highlight the reality in developing countries, many of which are commodity dependent, and the unique challenges in small island developing states. Let's take this opportunity to discuss critical inequalities and whether the COVID-19 crisis should lead to changes in policy to build economies for a world of shared prosperity. I'm now pleased to introduce Ms. Isabelle Durand, Deputy Secretary General of UNCTAD. Ms. Durand of Belgium took up the position of Deputy Secretary General on 3rd July 2017. She served as Acting Secretary General from 16th February to 12th September 2021. Since she career in Belgian and European politics. She held the office of Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Transport and Energy, and was a senator in the Belgian government. She also served as Vice President of the European Parliament and President of the European Union Council of Ministers of Transport. Ms. Giron has a wealth of experience collaborating with civil society and the private sector as well, notably as Vice President responsible for relations between the European Parliament and civil society. Ms. Giron, à vous.
Thank you, Peter. Je vais parler en français. Madame la Première ministre, chère Mia, Madame la secrétaire générale du CARICOM, Madame la haute commissaire aux droits de les Nations Unies, chère Michel, Madame la directrice exécutive d'Oxfam International, Monsieur le Président de la Banque d'investissement européenne, Excellences, chers modérateurs, Mesdames et Messieurs, réduire les inégalités entre les classes, les races ou les sexes est une aspiration que la plupart des sociétés ont embrassée. Des personnes ou des leaders emblématiques, parfois au péril de leur vie ou de leur liberté, les ont fait progresser. Mais de profondes inégalités subsistent. La mondialisation s'est accélérée à la fin du siècle dernier. Elle était censée contribuer à la prospérité économique dans le monde entier. Les opportunités et privilèges dont bénéficiaient les populations du Nord devaient pouvoir bénéficier à celles du Sud. Certes, elle a fait une part du chemin, mais des inégalités criantes subsistent. La révolution numérique nous offre la possibilité d'être plus connectés et par là la promesse d'être plus inclusifs, mais aux inégalités préexistantes sont venues se greffer de nouvelles fractures numériques, celles-là. Les inégalités ne se sont pas non plus tentées d'être omniprésentes et multiformes. Elles y tenaces, certaines nourries par des stéréotypes qui ont la peau dure. Il s'ensuit un très fort sentiment d'injustice qui s'est traduit un peu partout dans le monde ces dernières années par de nouvelles formes d'expression interconnectées. Black Lives Matter, Me Too ou les Fridays for Future de la génération climat qui interpellent tous les politiques publiques. D'autres mouvements capitalisent, voire instrumentalisent les colères, l'anxiété ou la peur de l'avenir. Mais dans les deux cas, nos institutions, nos gouvernances sont mises à l'épreuve. Comment se fait-il que nous ayons toléré pendant tout ce temps les inégalités que nous n'avons de cesse de dénoncer? La crise du Covid peut-elle enfin nous réveiller et être brillamment évoqué dans la session d'ouverture et le dialogue d'hier? L'accès aux vaccins nécessaires à la reprise reste très inégal. Jusqu'à présent, seuls 2% de la population des pays les moins avancés ont été vaccinés contre le Covid et cet état de fait nous menace tous, comme l'exprimait très clairement le docteur Tedros, ainsi d'ailleurs que Madame Gauzy, la directrice de l'OMC. Cette dernière a mis sur la table la possible renonciation aux droits de propriété intellectuelle pour la protection des vaccins. La discussion est en cours. Mais son impact positif sera limité si on n'aborde pas aussi et simultanément les capacités de production qui sont aujourd'hui concentrées dans les pays du G20. Si on n'aborde pas la question des transferts de technologie que cela implique, ainsi que les barrières commerciales à faire tomber pour les produits essentiels. Les pays développés et les pays en développement sont désormais sur des voies de redressement divergentes. Madame Greenspan en parlait hier. C'est évidemment à cause de l'asymétrie en matière de ressources et de capacités budgétaires et fiscales. Selon le rapport des Nations Unies sur le financement du développement durable, les PMA, les pays les moins avancés, en groupe, n'ont pu mobiliser qu'un montant équivalent consacrée est de 15,8% du PIB, soit 7 fois plus. Il est clair que ces trajectoires divergentes, si elles ne sont pas urgemment corrigées, laisseront des centaines de millions de personnes sur le carreau. En 2020, la pandémie a fait retomber dans la pauvreté environ 120 millions de personnes dans le monde. Et selon nos estimations, pour les pays les moins avancés, au moins 32 millions sont passés sous le seuil de pauvreté. Il s'agit d'ailleurs en grande partie de ceux qui ont perdu leur activité, leur emploi, leurs revenus et ne bénéficient d'aucune ou à peu près d'aucune protection sociale. À l'autre extrémité de la répartition des revenus, la richesse de nombreux riches ou très riches a considérablement augmenté. De leur côté, les investissements ont commencé à se redresser et c'est positif. Mais ce qui est préoccupant, c'est qu'une fois encore, c'est asymétrique. Plus de 80% de la valeur des investissements de reprise se trouve dans les pays développés et ceux que nécessite le développement durable et l'adaptation au changement climatique cruellement défendus. Le soutien aux entreprises et des conditions de travail décentes pour ceux qui y travaillent, et cela dans des chaînes de valeur réorganisées, plus régionales, plus redistributives, s'impose. Le renforcement des marchés régionaux est en effet une autre voie assez prometteuse. Et, moyennant évidemment de bonnes politiques, l'accord de libre-échange continental africain, pour ne citer que celui-là, peut offrir de nombreuses opportunités pour les quelques 1,2 milliard de personnes qui vivent sur ce continent. Enfin, comme lors de nombreuses crises précédentes, les femmes et les filles ont payé un prix bien plus élevé. Désavantagées de longue date dans les écosystèmes économiques, sociaux, financiers ou réglementaires, la crise les a frappées de manière disproportionnée. Le taux d'emploi des femmes a baissé davantage que celui des hommes et de nombreuses femmes confrontées à des charges de plus en plus lourdes ont finalement complètement quitté le marché du travail. Celles qui y sont restées ont été bien plus exposées, mobilisées dans le secteur des soins ou dans celui de la distribution. Et cette injustice commence tôt. Bien plus de filles que de garçons ont été retirées de l'école pour s'occuper de tâches domestiques. Cette dynamique aura évidemment des conséquences désastreuses à long terme. En outre, pour garantir des résultats plus inclusifs, les femmes doivent être associées à la conception des politiques et à la mise en œuvre des plans de relance au niveau national. Mais leur sous-représentation dans ces processus décisionnels est, permettez-moi de le dire, aussi injuste que absurde. La vie en ligne que nous connaissons depuis bientôt 2 ans nous a été particulièrement précieuse, encore aujourd'hui, et a ouvert de nouvelles perspectives. Mais elle a aussi révélé de façon spectaculaire la fracture numérique entre régions, pays, communautés, groupes de population. Le chantier en vue d'un usage productif des technologies et des données numériques est immense. Les données sont une nouvelle ressource, mais elles sont aussi très inégalement collectées, corrélées, transformées en valeur économique qui sert au développement. Il faut être clair, le monde de la tech n'attendra pas. Développer les infrastructures, les compétences numériques, les cadres juridiques et la régulation sont autant d'urgences pour que l'économie numérique serve le développement et non plus seulement les intérêts de quelques grands groupes privés. Enfin, les pays en développement sont en première ligne dans notre lutte contre le changement climatique. Ils en expérimentent les effets de plus en plus rapidement. Les panélistes d'hier, chefs d'État particulièrement exposés, n'ont eu de cesse de le rappeler. Car en effet, si ces impacts sont ressentis partout dans le monde, les régions tropicales et subtropicales en sont l'épicentre. En 2020, les Caraïbes ont connu les tempêtes les plus violentes jamais enregistrées. La hausse du niveau des mers, les sécheresses et les pénuries d'eau douce poussent des communautés entières à se déplacer et menacent la sécurité alimentaire. Et cela alors même que nombre de ces pays figurent parmi les moins responsables des émissions de CO2. Comme ce fut rappelé hier, les petits États insulaires en développement sont responsables de moins de 1% des émissions, mais ils sont les plus vulnérables. Ils ne sont cependant pas les seuls à payer un très lourd tribut au choix du passé. Encore une asymétrie qu'il va nous falloir changer, non seulement d'ailleurs pour les générations futures, mais aussi pour celles d'aujourd'hui. Pour promouvoir une croissance plus verte et changer les indicateurs qui la mesurent, les pays doivent adapter leurs méthodes de production, investir dans des secteurs plus respectueux de l'environnement et rendre leurs infrastructures résistantes au changement climatique. Il en va de même pour la transition énergétique. Au-delà des énergies renouvelables, il est clair que la révolution technologique à l'œuvre exigera une production accrue de matières premières comme le cobalt, le lithium ou les terres rares. Mais ce qui est tout aussi clair, c'est que les préoccupations environnementales et sociales vont devoir être prises en compte tout au long de la chaîne de valeur de ces matières premières. Alors, Excellences, chers panélistes, chers amis, avons-nous atteint un point de rupture à partir duquel on peut construire différemment? Hier, notre secrétaire général, M. Guterres, a souligné la nécessité urgente d'agir sur le surendettement, tant dans les pays à faible revenu que dans les pays à revenus intermédiaires. Cela nécessite un soutien en liquidité, notamment une réaffectation des fameux droits de tir spéciaux inutilisés aux pays vulnérables. L'initiative de suspension du service de la dette du G20 est évidemment la bienvenue. Mais comme M. Guterres l'expliquait hier, ses critères d'éligibilité et son calendrier devraient être évidemment beaucoup moins limités. Mais même adaptée, cette suspension est insuffisante et nous avons besoin d'un allègement affectif de la dette, de financement privé et de politiques efficaces de redistribution. Sans cela, les inégalités subsisteront et se renforceront. Ça n'ira pas évidemment tout seul, tant se font entendre la voix de ceux qui ont intérêt au statu quo, comme le disait très justement Mme Motley hier. Mais aucune de ces politiques n'a de chance de donner des résultats si chacune d'elles est menée isolément ou au seul niveau national. Plus que jamais, l'interconnexion des domaines d'action, autant que les interdépendances du monde, doivent guider notre feuille de route. Vous ne serez donc pas étonnés que la CNUSET appelle à un multilatéralisme plus inclusif et en réseau qui donne une voix adéquate au Sud et à sa diversité. Voilà, telles sont les réflexions que je voulais partager avec vous pour encadrer la discussion que je me réjouis évidemment de suivre avec le plus grand intérêt. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Directrice.
Well, we thank Ms. Durand for her remarks. I want to tell you now who our panelists will be this morning. With me here in the studio, we have Prime Minister of Barbados, the Honourable Mia Mormati, and Dr. Carla Bonnet, who is the Secretary General of the Caribbean Committee. We also have in Geneva, Ms. Michelle Bachelet, who is the United Nations Commissioner for Human Rights, Ms. Gabriela Boucher, Executive Director of Oxfam International, and Mr. Werner Hoyer, President of the European Investment Bank. So that's our panel. Peter, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Sharon, and indeed, what an interesting panel we have. It's my pleasure now to welcome our next guest and panel. Sharon said, Ms. Michelle Bachelet is the current United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. She was also elected the President of Chile on 2 different occasions between 2006 and 2010, and 2014 and but particularly those of the most vulnerable. Amongst her achievements are education and tax reforms, and the creation of the National Institute for Human Rights, as well as the Museum of Memory and Human Rights. So does the establishment of the Ministry of Women and Gender Equality. In 2011, she was named the first director of the UN Women, an organization dedicated to fighting for the rights of women and girls internationally. Ms. Bachelet that I'm going to throw her two questions in rapid succession. Thanks for joining us, Ms. Bachelet. First question, inequality are apparent in many forms. From a human rights perspective, what inequalities have been exacerbated by this crisis that urgently need to be addressed? And has the crisis been sufficiently disruptive to lead to real change in policy to inequalities? And the second question, if you like, and I'll repeat this at the end of your first answer, how can concerns feed into global discussions and multilateral processes, such as those at the Human Rights Council and other fora serviced by Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights? Over to Ms. Bachelet.
Thank you, Peter, and all my dear panelists. Well, at the outset, I want to thank UNCTAD and the government of Barbados for their invitation. It is a real honor to be able to participate and address this World Leaders Summit dialogue on inequality, because inequality is not, and non-discrimination is part of my whole life as a cause. So it has the core of my office mission at the corner of the agenda to leave no one behind. And exacerbate the pre-existing, intersecting structural discrimination and deep-rooted inequalities within countries and among them. And unfortunately, you asked me which one from the human rights perspective. Unfortunately, almost all of them, because it has exacerbated in some places, of course, with social and economic consequences, and of course the right to life on the health crisis, the right to a healthy environment because of the environmental crisis that is additional to COVID-19, but also, if I would say, the social and economic crisis that increased COVID, unemployment, and all those consequences. But so inequalities are manifesting themselves in multiple forms, such as unequal access to protection and healthcare, safe water, basic sanitation or education, and all of these inequalities hamper people's full enjoyment of the human rights, especially their economic, social, and cultural rights, and the right to development. For all of these reasons, it is a health crisis, it is a social and economic crisis. We have this triple environmental crisis of climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss. So we have an addition of all of these that are really hampering the full enjoyment of people's human rights. But I would like to mention something that it's very important to understand, that even this crisis affects everyone. It affects disproportionately certain groups of people. And I'm saying this because we're talking about leaving no one behind, because we're thinking on policies that can address these inequalities. If we do that in a way that we believe that everyone has been touched in the same way, we will be maintaining people who will be even further behind. So that's why we have been calling for a human rights-based approach in terms of identify which are the main groups that have been affected. I can mention some of them that we already know: women and children, older people, people living with disabilities, people on the move, that means refugees, migrants, IDPs, LGBTI communities, and of course, people who are living with restrictions on their mobility, being like people in prisons or people in healthcare facilities, like older people, and of course as well indigenous groups or Afro descent minorities, ethnic minorities. So we need, when you think of policies, how to address these inequalities, we need to think not only in homogeneous policies, and just that, of course, we need to ensure social protection to everyone. We need to ensure health coverage to everyone, education. We need to look at that, but we also, for example, in education, we need to take care of the digital divide, the gender divide, to see which are the real policies that can help us to really address these inequalities. On the second part, has this crisis been sufficiently disruptive to lead to a real change in policy to combat inequalities? I would love to say yes, but the truth is not yet. And I think, and Isabel was mentioning, the example of the vaccine distribution and vaccine has been one that really shows how the world, even everybody speaks about the need of strong multilateralism, the need of collective action, the need of international cooperation is not happening yet at the level it should be. So has cost us decades of hard-won development progress, and now we have major setbacks in many of those hard-won achievements. And if we look at the rhetoric around the pandemic, we have seen, as I said, many positive signs. But if we look at the reality on the ground, it's easy to be about whether there is the political and financial commitment to actually work. I have to say, having been in office before, I have to say something challenging and difficult to deal with. But whether away. So I think we need to continue working strongly, stopping vaccine nationalism, because I think it's a crucial test to our commitment to ending inequalities. It is a disgrace that higher income countries administer 61 times more doses per inhabitant than low income countries, according to WHO. But we also know that universal and equitable access to COVID-19 vaccine remains one of the strongest determinants of countries' ability to control the pandemic, stop human suffering, but also be able to move towards a sustainable recovery of the economy. And so we have called for I have called for the beginning recognition of COVID-19 vaccine as a global public good. And I really urge states to support the Secretary General's call for a global vaccination plan to ensure that vaccine reach 70% of the world's population by the first half of 2022. This implies sharing health technologies, data, knowledge, treatment, and flexibility in trade. So it's only the first most urgent step. To secure real change, we need to build human economies that are really built on human rights as the fundamental level to achieve what the Secretary General called us to review social contract that is anchored in human rights as a centerpiece of our common agenda. Marginal people suffering from structural discrimination and inequalities need to be at the center of these efforts. We need to invest as well in disaggregated community data. And this requires the great international solidarity encapsulated in the Declaration to the Right of Development. And I think that adopting expansive economic and fiscal policies and expanding social expenditure is the right thing to do at times of crisis. Let me give you some examples. High-income countries are investing nearly 8% of the gross domestic product into their economic recovery. For middle-income countries, this number falls to 6.5%. But if you think of the least developed countries, about 1.8%. So more needs to be done to afford these developed countries and small island developing states the necessary fiscal space to also adopt counter-cyclical measures. Lastly, do not say something, I would say that women have been particularly impacted not only on their possibilities to have an access to healthcare, to other sexual and health and reproductive services that have been cut, vaccines, but also they are very important for the economy. How to ensure that women are part of the solution, there is a gender responsive plan to the crisis and to the recovery.
You know how difficult it is to get such brilliant minds in the same place at the same time. And, you know, just looking back at yesterday and into today, really filled with hope that despite all these challenges that the world is facing today, you're talking about climate change and you're talking about the coronavirus pandemic. These minds in place with these people in charge are filled with hope that somehow we're to pull through. Over to you, Sharon.
You're quite right, Peter. It's a wonderful opportunity to have so many brilliant minds in one space to discuss the pressing issues. And I hope that we find cause for optimism and a positive outcome to these discussions. Well, as I mentioned previously, with me in the studio is Dr. Carla Barnett, who is Secretary General of the Caribbean Community. She became the first woman to hold that position when she assumed office on August 15th this year. Dr. Barnett is an economist who has worked across the English-speaking Caribbean, breaking several barriers along the way. She was the first woman to be appointed as Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Belize, the first woman and the youngest person to be appointed as Deputy Secretary General of CARICOM. Dr. Barnett is a longtime advocate for gender equality, not only because it is the right thing to do to create a more stable and equitable society, but also because she believes that gender equality is good economic policy. So, Dr. Barnett, I pose the first question to you. From your perspective, which support instruments fall short to address the particular challenges faced by small island developing states, and how can we change this to help national and regional recovery and build resilience?
I am more than truly proud, and I have to say that the arrangements on the ground here are impeccable. The surroundings are beautiful, and the hospitality is warm, exceptionally Barbadian. So I'm really happy to be here. This meeting provides an opportunity to highlight to the global community the issues and concerns of small islands and low and coastal development states, and to identify the measures that can be done by the international community to support our efforts to build resilience and to promote sustainable development. SIDS experienced contract 2020 at about 3 times the global rate. The devastation to the health systems and to economic activity meant that at exactly the same time that we needed to be able to address the health emergency, our economies and public finances contracted sharply. So we did the best we could. We applied funds that were budgeted to meet other purposes, to meet the needs of the health sector for PPEs, for medical equipment, testing supplies, vaccines. We shifted funds within our budgets to meet basic social safety nets. We repurposed loans and borrowed funds. Already high debt burdens grew higher. To temporarily suspend debt service payments to their official bilateral creditors, that's set to expire in December 2021. While this program had potential, it does not cover all middle to high income developing countries, many of which are SIDS. It also does not include private creditors, so that severely limits the potential of its impact. 40% of developing countries received a credit downgrade in 2020. Furthermore, the new debt arising from the need to address the COVID crisis, together with the existing debt stock, will continue to appropriate significant portions of public resources in debt repayments. This will strangle the ability of our countries to undertake critical public infrastructure investments which are required for economic rehabilitation. An effective response to this must include significant and broad debt reduction for all developing countries, including vulnerable middle to high income states. Debt reduction should specifically address the buildup due to COVID and due to climate change adaptation. Many SIDS can no longer access multilateral and bilateral concessional funding because of their relative capital. We've talked about this a lot. With the reality of takes on even greater urgency. We have to continue to press for the implementation of the multidimensional vulnerability index. We therefore call on the UN system to intensify collaboration with relevant regional institutions, particularly in the Caribbean, the Pacific, and the Indian Ocean, to make this index a reality. Additionally, we call on the IMF, the World Bank, as well as bilateral and multilateral development partners to step away from the blinders of GDP per capita and apply what we learn in Development Economics 101, that GDP per capita cannot be a measure of development, let alone sustainable development. Resource mobilization for rehabilitation, adaptation, and building resilience remains a priority for CARICOM. The new IMF SDR allocation of $600 billion is a step towards providing additional liquidity to the global financial system. CARICOM member states are likely to receive about $17 billion, which is about 1/3 of the funding boost initially projected for the recovery of CARICOM states. The call by the IMF Managing Director for countries with strong external positions to channel some of their SDRs to countries which need them most, the pledges already made to expand the resources under the IMF's Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, and the proposals to challenge SDRs to support structural transformation in vulnerable countries, either through the establishment of a new resilience and sustainability trust or some other form of multilateral development bank initiative. These are all welcome. However, until these new options are developed, multilateral support is on the basis of the same policy menu, traditionally, and funding instruments that have been used to handle economic imbalances in the past. That menu does not adequately address our inherent vulnerabilities and fragilities, and will certainly be inadequate as a foundation for the design of recovery models that can build transformative and resilient economies in the face of global climate change. As we prepare for COP26, we welcome the recent re-engagement of major players and the commitments to meaningful reduction of CO2 emissions. It is vital that these be honored in order to limit global warming to 1.5 C. For SIDS like us in the CARICOM, 1.5 to stay alive is more than a catchy slogan. It is an existential reality. Successfully addressing our acute vulnerabilities requires SIDS to continue to strengthen technical, financial, and institutional capacity to adapt to environmental and economic shocks caused by climate change. Pledges to the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Funds must be honored and indeed increased in order to ensure that the most vulnerable can adapt. 5. Procedures for access to these funds also need to be simplified. We therefore have to be focused on pushing COP26 to be decisive, to keep the pathways to achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement alive and translating commitments to real action on the ground. COVID-19 is indeed a game changer, but the policy landscape for building resilient economies demands a willingness to think differently, and it requires innovative and transformative actions to address global inequality and drive inclusive growth.
Dr. Barnett, thank you very much for your remarks. I move to our next panelist, Prime Minister the Honorable Mia Amor-Motley, who is a woman of many notable achievements. She was one of the youngest persons in Barbados to be assigned a ministerial portfolio when she was appointed Minister of Education, Youth Affairs and Culture in 1994. An attorney at law by training, Ms. Motley later served as Attorney General and Deputy Prime Minister. She became Barbados's 8th Prime Minister and our first female Prime Minister in May 2018. Prime Minister Motley, I must confess that I feel some reluctance in posing this question to you because it might earn me a rebuke. Haven't you been listening to my recent speeches? But nevertheless, I am compelled to ask, what policies are needed to address the inequalities that we have for far too long endured to foster inclusive recovery, and what are the specific challenges of small island developing states?
Well, I'm actually not going to rebuke you for not listening to my speeches. I think that the Secretary General's comments just now answered a lot of that. And I say so conscious that much of the inequality that we are facing didn't just come about because of COVID. COVID has just laid it bare in a very stark way and has exacerbated it for sure. But the bottom line is that we have a level of inequality and poverty that is a hangover from colonial days and pre-independence days. And the realistic approach is such that even though we have achieved much, the truth is that the economic environment within which we've been forced to function has not necessarily given us the tools to be able to do so. And that's why you hear Dr. Barnett talking just now about not using GDP per capita as a measurement for access to concessionary funding, a recognition that much of the debt that we have undertaken as countries hasn't come because of profligacy or corruption, and even if there are examples of that, it's minuscule. It has come because of a lack of sustained development. When we formed the WTO, as I said yesterday, we have not looked back to see its scars on us with respect to the loss of productive capacity in manufacturing and agriculture. We have had to incur significant amounts of debt over the last 3 decades with respect to climatic events, or with respect to things like simply trying to be able to augment water or distribute water in our societies. And that infrastructural requirement is costly. At the same time, governments have choices to make. And if we're spending money servicing debt, that is very expensive as compared to debt that other countries can get at very affordable rates, then that additional debt service is taken away from access, paying for education or healthcare or other critical things that are necessary to keep our people alive. What COVID-19 has done has been to exacerbate those social divisions as well. And therefore, for example, persons who are suffering traditionally from chronic NCDs, they have been really, in many instances, put at the side in the course of the last 18 to 20 months, simply because access to healthcare in most hospitals has been limited to people who have been on the front line of the pandemic. In our case here, we were able to take a decision early on to refurbish our old U.S. naval base and literally put it as a dedicated hospital for COVID patients. And I want to thank Mr. Hoyer from the European Investment Bank, because they have agreed to come in and to do the financing with respect to that facility, which is retroactive in part, but more importantly, that the concessional framework for financing is very much there with the EIB on this loan. It's a 20-year loan. It has a 5-year moratorium, and the interest rate is, I think, 1.25%. That's the kind of developmental instrument that we need in order to be able to undertake some of the things that will reduce inequality in our societies. But I go further. I've been arguing that this event is not a normal event. It's a cataclysmic event. Some even refer to what is going on now as the equivalent of a world war. If we accept that, then we must accept that, especially for countries such as ours that have not had the capacity to be able to pump the level of fiscal stimuli in, even when we've had to pump it in, it's going to constrain our capacity for post-pandemic to be able to resume the development trajectory. And we're saying, look, there must be a way of taking the COVID debt post-January 2020 and refinancing it into exceptionally long instruments, either related instruments, so that you're talking about 50-year loans, you're talking about 0% interest, you're talking about a 10-year moratorium initially. Why? Because in the same way that Britain understood that it could not refinance its war debt while trying to pursue post-war recovery, we too will have a difficulty in being able to pursue post-COVID recovery and to reduce the inequalities that have been made more stark by COVID if we do not find a way of having these long-term instruments take some of the immediate pressures of debt service off of us. We also have to have a perspective as to what's sustainable. If you're going to continue to use the measurement by Rogoff that the anchor should be 60% debt to GDP, all of us are out of it. So that you can't even get back to a point of stability. So this COVID comes at a time when it is going to lead, I believe, to a fundamental rethink of the international financial architecture, as well as some of the instruments that are necessary for us to be able to pursue development. And if we don't do it, regrettably, we're going to see literally a cementing of people back into poverty at the very time that we were expecting to see movement towards the Sustainable Development Goals.
Are you that it can be accomplished?
I think that the majority of people in the world want to do the right thing. And that's why I framed it in terms of global moral strategic leadership. Global because this is not about a region like the Americas or Asia, it's about the world. Moral because it's about doing the right thing. And strategic is because we can't do everything. So we have to choose the few things that we think we can see and make a change on. And that's why I'm soon going to sound like a parrot. Because, one, as it relates to climate, it is adaptation. The reality is that the ambitions that are being put on the table are not sufficient to close the gap. And we will likely see the world go beyond the 1.5 degrees. Dr. Barnett has told you that this is an existential threat for us. That means that fundamentally in 15, 20 years' time, we can be seeing all kinds of bad things that we don't even want to contemplate. But we have to use now our funds to be able to ensure that we can prepare ourselves for it and minimize the impact of what that more than 1.5 degrees will do for us. At the same time, we have the pandemic too. So I can go on and show what is it pandemic. It's simple. The global rich countries, the rich countries of the world, ordered more than what they needed in terms of vaccines. In so doing, they left a huge, huge hole for variants and mutations to run through. They now find that they too are compromised because the mutations are affecting them in spite of they have vaccinations. So that it makes no sense to us. And I believe that while we may not have a unanimity, clearly, we are getting a reflection of a world that more and more is saying enough is enough. And that you cannot continue to have this kind of stark inequality, not now just at the level of people, but at the level of countries. And as I said, we talked about the SSI just now, Dr. Barnett spoke about it, the debt service suspension initiative. Clearly, they're going to have to look at extending it beyond December 2021. But here's the problem. It was never sufficient for the purpose for which it was intended. So therefore, even if you extend it, which you must for some countries, it has not met the needs of other countries in being able to go forward and allowing us to ease the pressure of the debt service in the pandemic when you want to be literally servicing your people instead of servicing your debt in that high way, as the Secretary General of the UN said yesterday. So I hope that we will find more and more persons recognizing that at this point in time, we need to do the right thing by the world, by the planet, and by our people. And the countries that have now to make those decisions are few. But they operate on the basis of self-protection first, which I understand in part, but self-protection is not going to carry you the journey. And we saw it, as I said, most evidently with the vaccines. Self-protection will give you an immediate feeling of comfort, but it's not going to protect you for the long run. And that's the message, perhaps more than anything. To go for the long run, we need to go together and not individually.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister. Peter, with that, I turn the proceedings back over to you.
Many thanks, Sharon. And one thing that stood out for me there in that little talk there by Prime Minister Motley is the fact that she says most people want to do the right thing. And it just echoes what myself and the Deputy Secretary General, Ms. Giron, were talking about before we came on air. And, you know, it's essentially the same thing that she says, that most people want to do the right thing across the world. We just need governments to key into that fact as well. Thank you very much, Prime Minister Motley. Thank you very much, Sharon. It's now time to introduce our next panelist. Gabriela Boucher is the Executive Director of Oxfam International, a global network which fights inequality to end poverty and injustice. Ms. Boucher is an experienced social justice leader and deeply committed to gender equality and human rights and to tackling economic inequality. Ms. Boucher, who grew up in Cali, Colombia, is a champion for feminist leadership and believes in the power of collaboration. She worked alongside children and communities affected by Colombia's decades-long armed conflict and contributed to peace building and youth active citizenship, influencing the country's approach on restorative justice for children. Now, prior to Oxfam, Ms. Boucher was the Chief Operating Officer at Plan International and led the Fundación Plan Colombia. Ms. Boucher, a question to you. The economic and social impact of the crisis have emerged quickly, but will take time to reverse. What international and national policies are needed most to reverse the adverse impacts on poverty and on economic and gender inequality?
Thanks, Peter, and thank you to UNCTAD and Prime Minister Motley, the government of Barbados. It's really an honor for Oxfam to be invited here today. And Excellencies, respected guests, we believe COVID-19 can be that game changer of our generation. More than we've seen before, we clearly have the talent, the resources, and the imagination to create a far more equal world. And I like the phrase the Prime Minister Motley was saying just now, there's a possibility of global, moral, strategic leadership. And we're seeing this new kind of recognition as well, that a world in which markets rule over governments and in which GDP masks the divisions between us, in which fossil fuels are still considered harmless necessities, these frankly dangerous ideas belong to the past and not the future. And yet, for most of the world, COVID is the wrong kind of game changer. For women like Chesa, she's 32 years old, she's a migrant in Southeast Asia who fillets fish that make their way to our supermarket shelves around the world. Her income has been hit hard. She had to move into temporary accommodation and she shared it with several others. At that time, the children were asking her for money, but I quote her, she had to say, "I have nothing to send them. I had to tell them to wait a bit more." But for those at the top end of the food chain, it's another story. Business is booming, and it would take Chesa nearly 6 millennia to earn what the CEO at a top US supermarket earns on average in a year. And COVID-19 is also the wrong kind of game changer for a girl I know, Fatou in Niger. She's 15, she only had a couple of years of high school, but is a respected young leader who fights discrimination hard. But every odd is stacked against her. Sexist norms, countless hours of unrewarded care work, floods that now reach her doorstep. And poor countries like hers now face austerity imposed upon them. So the fight against inequality must be won for these women. Yet we're far from seeing the kind of action we need by most governments. Consider that billionaire wealth shot up more over the past 17 months than it has over the past 15 years, while hundreds of millions have fallen into poverty. Consider that less than 1%, so less than 1% of the 6 billion COVID-19 vaccine doses have gone to low-income countries. In a humane world, a life-saving vaccine would be something that unites us all. But in today's neoliberal world, it is an instrument of division. So I want to give us 3 practical solutions if we are to reverse this crisis in order to offer real change for people like Chesa and Fatou. First, nothing is more urgent than breaking the monopolies that are restricting vaccine supply. That's how we end the deadly pandemic. To boost supply, we must ensure that pharma transfers its technologies through the World Health Organization to qualified producers. And we must waive intellectual property rules on COVID-19 vaccines at the World Trade Organization. and end the self-defeating opposition to this by Europe, by UK, and by Germany. Oxfam has been fighting for a people's vaccine since the start of this pandemic. Oxfam stands with many developing nations, with people in countries across the world on this issue, that is the issues of our time. Second, there is no avoiding that we must rein in the extreme wealth that is fueling today's crisis. Too much income is being extracted from women like Chesa, who deserves at least a living wage. Too much is being extracted from poor countries that should be funding education for girls like Fatu, while oceans of cash is sloshing around the darkness of tax havens, as this week's shocking and brave Pandora Papers expose shows. Universal healthcare, universal education, universal social protection begin with a global fund for social protection for low-income countries. These must be the legacies of the pandemic. These are the powerful equalizers for economic and for racial and gender inequalities. Because women and girls lose opportunities most of all when healthcare and education come with a fee, not as a right. The fiscal space exists to pay for this and more. So crisis should spur bold action. After World War II, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt ensured corporations paid between 40 to 50% tax rates. And that stayed for decades. That was the social contract at the time. And that's ambition. It contrasts that with global tax negotiations taking place this year. The G7 and the OECD are pushing a 15% minimum corporate tax rate in line with tax havens. Ahead of this month's G20, we must raise our voices for at least a 25% minimum rate. And finally, let me end where I started, with hope. Because some countries are showing a different way is possible, such as Sierra Leone, which made secondary education free, or Costa Rica pulling off quality healthcare in a decade, or Namibia recognized as sixth in the world by the World Economic Forum for reducing its gender gap, or Uruguay, which enshrined in law and invested in the care economy, or Argentina, which has been taxing the rich and using that to fund its COVID response. And it's not just countries. There's a different way of doing multilateralism, which UNCTAD is showing in this conference, that acts with solidarity with the poorest. You bravely continue to put forward the bold, necessary solutions at UNCTAD on a WTO waiver, on debt, on tax. So you give us hope. And listening to you, Prime Minister Motley, yesterday and now today, you gave us all hope. And we thank you for that.
Ms. Boucher, thank you very much for your comments, and we will still hear from you a little later during this session. Next now, I'd like to invite the President of the European Investment Bank, Mr. Werner Hoyer. Upon appointment by the EU member states, Mr. Hoyer started his first term as EIB President in January 2012. This is his second term. Mr. Hoyer served for 24 years as a member of the German Bundestag. During this period, he held the position of Minister of State at the Foreign Office on 2 separate occasions. Thanks for joining us, Herr Hoyer. My question to you, addressing inequalities and fostering more inclusive recovery requires financial resources. I mean, we've all seen that in the last 18 to 20 months. How can the EIB contribute?
Madam Prime Minister, Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let me first thank you very much for inviting me to this exciting conference and exchange. In these truly exceptional times, our resilience is tested to the maximum extent. Our societies are not equipped to live in a world dominated by inequality and uncertainty for too long. Our challenge today is a test of multilateralism. Our response must be a testament to the strength of our multilateral ties. What we need is commitment and flexibility to cushion the dramatic impact of the COVID-19 crisis while being more decisive about the shared principles and long-term objectives guiding our recovery. Many of you know the European Investment Bank as the EU Climate Bank, not least as a result of our resounding no to financing fossil fuel-based energy projects. What not many of you might know is our commitment to innovation. We have the largest portfolio of innovation projects held by any multilateral development bank. And our commitment to development, lending roughly 10 billion euros outside the European Union every year. For me, it is very important to highlight this wide range of activities. Climate, innovation, development must all be seen as inseparable parts of the same approach. Only if we manage to work and succeed on all three fronts together will we have a chance of transitioning towards a sustainable economic system, rapidly reducing greenhouse emissions, and achieving the same UN Sustainable Development Goals. As a global bank, at the EIB, we provide tailored support to different regions worldwide. In addition to our financial firepower, our great strength lies in our technical expertise. At the bank, quite unusual for banks, an army of top engineers and scientists puts every single project through its paces, which ensures the project's sustainability. Our engineers contribute to significant knowledge transfer both within and beyond the European Union. EIB's development work represents an investment bridge between EU policies and projects on the ground in response to the growing demand for strategic cooperation between the world and Europe. It is important for us to listen to leaders and partners with players that are ambitious and committed innovators. And I'm convinced that this is a key for mapping shared investment priorities to ensure a sustainable and inclusive recovery. In response to the pandemic, we have mobilized financing in more than 100 countries outside of Europe by combining EU guarantees with EIB financing. Team Europe has greatly supported COVAX and stayed committed to it. Also, I must say we know that this all is not enough. But we are proud to be early backers of BioNTech, for instance, whose mRNA technology has been so instrumental in the fight against COVID. And we knew them before we have helped them develop their cancer treatment instruments in the years before. Ladies and gentlemen, while we have to step up vaccination efforts, climate change is intensifying the world's challenges, causing forest displacement and contributing to fragility. Many of the vulnerable regions suffering the most have contributed very little of global greenhouse gas emissions. These countries now have the opportunity to leapfrog directly into a greener future through the use of new technologies. We at EIB have 6 decades of experience in providing development finance. Over the last 10 years, our financing outside the EU has totaled 80 billion euros, of which 27 billion has gone to Africa and half has gone to the private sector. We have developed and refined our operations significantly in recent years, harmonizing our approach with the positive changes occurring in emerging economies. And those changes took on a new impetus from discussions among EU policymakers on how to enhance European finance architecture for development. I'm happy to share with you that from January 2022, the EIB will reorganize our activities into a dedicated organizational structure for development. This will improve the way we deliver our development finance in close cooperation with our colleagues from the European Commission and the European External Action Service. We will strengthen our local presence, placing more bankers and engineers at the disposal of Team Europe on the ground. This will mean more development impact. It will respond to the growing need for ever stronger bonds between Europe and the world, enhancing economic and trade ties. We are not daunted by the challenges. In fact, we are inspired by our mission to put the European Union's climate action and development goals into operation on the ground, and by our role in supporting the fulfillment of the ambitious aspirations of our partners. The recovery will take time and energy, and it will require close partnerships building on our respective strengths. We look forward to working very closely with many of the organizations participating in this exciting dialogue today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Herr Hoyer, for your contribution. And we shall still hear from you later on. I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Sharon in Barbados, who's going to ask you a second set of questions. Sharon.
Thank you, Peter. It was quite heartening to hear Dr. Hoyer say that the EIB is not daunted by the challenges. He recognizes that the recovery will take time and energy. So that is an optimistic note on which he ended. I want to pose a second question to my panelists. How can national and regional concerns feed into global discussions and multilateral processes for a more equal world? Prime Minister?
I don't even know what to tell you.
Now I get the rebuke.
Yeah, no, it's not a rebuke, but it is. I've said, in fact, it was in Geneva when I did the Raoul Prebisch lecture, that regrettably, it seems as though too many small island developing states were invisible and seen as dispensable. That was 2 years ago when I said that. I wish I could say something different today. The mere fact that the ambitions being exhibited by the larger countries and some of the emerging markets of the world do not allow us to reach the 1.5 degrees tells you that we are going to be collateral damage with respect to what is going to happen in the next few decades. And so when you ask how do national and regional concerns feed in, with great difficulty. It's challenging. I think we've seen some movement, but the question always is it sufficient movement? And that's why I used the phrase last week about minding the gap. The gap is still going to be there on climate. The gap is still going to be there on financing that's required now and the liquidity issues that we need eased at this point in the pandemic. The gap is still there with respect to the post-pandemic situation unless we find a long-term instrument to take out the COVID-related debt and allow us to pursue the development trajectory again to the SDGs. So the question is, how do we close that gap? Regrettably, that gap can only be closed by the political will of a few. It is a man-made construct. It can be changed by man. But we are not yet in that sensitivity to the realities of others. And as I said, if they didn't do it with the vaccines, where there is a definite benefit to themselves, you wonder whether you're going to see the movement with sufficient time. We pray we'll continue to fight for it, but the reality is that for 30 years or more we've been talking about vulnerability. Well, vulnerability has become real now because it's no longer about the risk of vulnerability. It's about the reality of climatic events. For 30 years, we've been talking about not using GDP per capita. For 30 years, we've been saying globally you cannot have a one-size-fits-all prescription, because once you have that one-size-fits-all prescription, you do not take into account the real needs. And I'll turn it back 30 years ago. I came into public life when the whole discussion, as I said yesterday, was around special and differential treatment. And we said that, look, regulation should be appropriate to risk. What happens? You have small states like Barbados, whose percentage of global trade in goods is 0.000%, and whose percentage of global trade in services is 0.0001%. Now, there's nothing that we can do in any form or fashion that will ever distort global trade. But yet the rules on countries themselves are the same as they are on large countries. Now, if we don't accept that regulation must be appropriate to risk, then we are not admitting of the possibility of development for small states. And I go back to that point only to show you that in spite of the innate wisdom of the thesis, there has not been an acceptance of it by the part of the international community for more than 3 decades. So I don't want to be jaded, but equally I'm very much a realist, and that is why sometimes I'm as blunt as I am, because it doesn't make sense being polite if the polite is going to lead to increased poverty?
Follow on, as the head of a regional agency representing the interest of individual nations but the collective, how can our voices feed into the global discussions and the multilateral process to create a more equal world?
Sharon, the reality is that we are in an unequal world, and we are at the other end of the spectrum, the weaker end, the smaller end, the group of countries that have traditionally been ignored. The international financial architecture in particular, coming out of World War II with the IMF, the World Bank, we didn't exist at that time. I heard PM say that the other day, and it's true. We did not exist as countries at that time. We are here now. The structures that were invented to sort through the war, those are not relevant to the problems that we're dealing with today. Let me give you an example. One of the things that COVID caused us to realize is that food insecurity is really a fundamental problem in our region. We import our food. The 6 billion or some ridiculous number like that we import every year. And it's not that we are incapable of being productive in agriculture. We live in a system where we as small countries are prohibited either by the programs that we're involved in with the international community, by the rules of the WTO, from subsidizing our agriculture sector. So we cannot put any significant funding into subsidizing agriculture. The major industrial countries provide the largest portion of subsidies to their agricultural sector. And we can't have a reasonable conversation about that because of the structure in which we live. We have to change those things. We have to really be understanding that we are questioning the way in which the international financial architecture is constructed, because it is not relevant to the problems that we are faced with right now, whether that problem is the rising poverty, that's an extreme poverty as a result of the economic contraction. For the first time since we invented the Human Development Index, we're seeing it go down. It's for the very first time, and we have to understand the implication of that. Implication that we are having poverty increase, but that poverty is increasing where poverty already exists. So we are worsening, we are making that divide significantly larger, and so we have to continue to press for it, and we have to question the very basis on which the international economic relations are structured. And if we don't know that that's what we have to do, if the other side, the big side, the rich side, don't understand that as a global arrangement, all have to survive. If one is to survive, then I am probably even more jaded than the Prime Minister. Yes. Thank you.
Because at the onset of the pandemic, we heard this mantra that we're all in it together. But evidently, we're all being tossed on the same sea, but we're not all sailing in the same vessel. Some are in luxury yachts, and some are in little fishing boats just hanging on.
Absolutely, and the thing that COVID has laid bare for everybody to see is the global inequality. And even within our countries, we saw the inequalities, and we are trying to sort that out as best we can. But at a global level, the inequalities are laid bare.
Thank you.
COVID has come to do what mankind couldn't do on its own. And in so doing, it has really, really shown us that this is a point in history for us to either do the right thing or for us to pay the consequences of doing nothing or the wrong thing. And it's as simple as that.
The other troubling aspect is with regard to education. How many people are losing out?
That's
what
the point.
Are the implications for the future?
Yeah, that actually, as I keep saying, is my greatest fear, because you will get back some of the children, but you're going to lose some who are at that point in their development that the absence of a firm hand guiding them for 18 months, not even only in terms of the academic, but also in terms of the developmental aspect, because children's social and emotional learning targets matter in a school environment. And one of the realities is that most countries have not been able to acquire the kinds of tablets and other instruments that are necessary. And even if they did, the absence of the spatial monitoring, being in that same space with a child, does matter, because you can't guarantee that every child's home is going to give them that support structure, but at least when you have them in the school or the church, you have another chance at literally lifting that child and giving them purpose in their lives and showing them that somebody else can be there for them. So the other thing that bothers me too, and we don't talk about it, is the extent to which abuse, particularly within homes, whether it is physical abuse or verbal abuse, and there's a lot of frustration because the restriction of people's movements will last for so long, but it is going to have an impact on people. And that's why the tools that countries can use now are smaller than the tools they could even have used 6 months ago or 9 months ago. And therefore, that's why the absolute need for vaccines is critical, because vaccines will be the best protection you can have next to the physical protocols that, that we've asked people to adhere to.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister and Dr.
Thank you.
And Ms. Gabriella Boucher of Oxfam, I'm going to ask you the same question. How can national and regional concerns feed into global discussions and multilateral processes for a more equal world? Because you very poignantly gave the case of someone at an individual level, so that you made it about people. So how can national and regional concerns feed in?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, it's very much about people, but as the panel is saying there in Barbados, it looks as if that is forgotten in the middle of all these discussions. And we know, and I will need to emphasize again, that vaccines are at key for the world to really control the pandemic. And this has been known from the beginning. And of course, at the beginning, the main barrier was science. But since then, the barrier hasn't been science. Once the vaccines were available, there's been pledges of donations, but the pledges have not materialized. They take a very long time. So there are many countries waiting at the end of the queue, and this means huge impact in individual lives, not only deaths that unfortunately deaths that would be avoidable, but also, of course, all the economic impact that this is having. And we know that this moment in time, we expect, unfortunately, inequality to increase within and across countries at the same time, not seen since record began. So absolutely, the issue of vaccines is essential, and at the same time to learn from this opportunity and understand that we need to be prepared for future pandemics, and to have a pandemic treaty that allows us to have a response that is adequate and centered on people's rights across the world. And at the same time, we need to be conscious that as we focus on this very immediate threat of the pandemic and all its consequences, we have the much bigger threat and the big catastrophe of the climate crisis. And the climate crisis is also an inequality crisis, because we know that the richest 1% of humanity uses double the carbon of the poorest 50%, who are hit hardest by climate change. So the action we must see is one that brings down the emissions of the richest to really stand a chance of defeating climate change. And that means wealth taxes, it means taxes and bans on luxury carbon such as SUVs and frequent flights. And it's not about more net zero promises that are vague from governments and corporations that pass on the buck for reducing emissions to others, or hide excessively behind planting trees and sometimes unproven technologies. We really need to focus on real zero targets that drastically cut emissions, phase out fossil fuels, and invest in the carbon sectors. And we need wealthy countries to urgently increase their pledges of climate finance. At least 50% of climate finance should be spent on adaptation by those who did the most to cut this crisis, to cause the crisis, to meet the rights of those who did the least and who are now facing the consequences. Governments have shown that they can act in a crisis, especially those governments that have acted fast in vaccinations, for themselves, but trying to simply reboot our extractive and destructive COVID economy won't be the solution. So we need to really seize the moment to move to a far more sustainable, healthier, and equal economy. And I think we all agree here, if we don't do this now, when?
Thank you so much, Ms. Boucher. And our final speaker, Dr. Hoyer, you have the last word.
Well, thank you very much. To respond quite simply is to say, I think we can very well achieve that. The European Union was founded on multilateralism, and indeed the promotion of regional integration is a central pillar of our relations with the rest of the world. Through our development cooperation, we have invested hundreds of millions of euros into regional integration through, for example, the Caribbean Community, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, the Association of Southeastern Asian Nations, the African Union, many other regional organizations. We are leading the way in establishing economic partnership agreements that support trade and investment in an equitable and balanced manner. The European Union is on the power of unity in diversity, and this diversity does not stop at our borders. We believe that everyone is strengthened, but we embrace diversity and act in unity. So let us consider the impact of climate change on small island states. We congratulate the Caribbean and Pacific nations on their leadership in promoting the need for decisive action on climate, and particularly on adaptation. As highlighted by the region's leaders, we urgently need to prioritize investments enhancing resilience. For the EU, climate adaptation is about promoting opportunities and development while preparing for an uncertain future. The project that EIB is financing are about making sure that when extreme events occur, people are protected and continue living their lives in safety. These projects take time to prepare and implement, but when EIB is involved, we act to ensure the highest standards of environmental and social due diligence, good governance, and accountability. This approach assures value for money for the citizens that benefit from the projects we finance. Considering the challenges posed by climate change, we need to do more, and we need to do it faster. We need additional initiatives and projects in order to address the investment gap that vulnerable nations are facing. Public funding and traditional grant instruments will not solve all the challenges. EIB will help identify and implement innovative financial instruments for the benefit of small island states and vulnerable nations. One flagship initiative is EU's blending facilities, which in the last decades have made around 10 billion euros of money available in grants to complement loan financing by multilateral development banks. In the future, such grants will also be complemented by guarantees to promote greater private sector participation, which is urgently needed. Such blended finance has led to improved social and environmental outcomes of investments. It has promising training and awareness raising around climate vulnerability. It has increased the affordability of new social infrastructure and improved access to finance for millions of small businesses. And this is just one example of how the EU is working to provide global solutions based on our understanding of national and regional challenges, especially for the most vulnerable. So, ladies and gentlemen, multilateralism is the lifeblood of the European Union. The EU and the United Nations are inseparable partners in this respect. We stand for a rules-based global governance system, and together we respond to global crises, threats, and challenges that cannot be addressed by individual nations acting alone and require cooperation and coordination based on universal values. So a big thank you for bringing us all together today. We look forward to working with you in tackling all these challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hoyer. I'm going to go to colleague Peter Okwache in Geneva. Peter, I know that you're usually at the other end of questions, so I hope you don't mind if I pose one to you. In the course of your work, you're out and about and interacting with leaders, you're interacting with people at all levels. I know you recently traveled to Nigeria, you're in London. we're going through a very dark time. What have you seen that has given you cause for optimism that we will come out at the other end of this?
You know what, Sharon, I think it's, your question is quite apt, because that's what I was just thinking about, listening to our panelists now. And, you know, this curious mixture of frustration in their answers and hope on the other end. Frustration from the likes of Prime Minister Motley and Prime Minister Brown of Antigua and Barbuda, when they say that the voices of small island developing states, or most vulnerable states, or states from the global south, are not being heard, even when they're called to come and speak on the table. But then you hear some of the solutions they're proffering, and you realize that these problems that we're talking about are not insurmountable. There's just this need for the will from these bigger developed nations, these bigger governments, that actually are the ones who are causing most of the greenhouse gas emissions that we're talking about in relation to climate change today. I'll give you a little story about my neck of the woods where I come from, in Nigeria. In the northwest of Nigeria, a lot of people, when they talk about the northwest, and I beg your pardon, northeast of Nigeria, think about the Boko Haram insurgency, which is a fact, and it's been going on for over a decade now. But there's a lake there, it's called Lake Chad. It's bordered by 4 different African countries, so Nigeria, Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. It's the biggest lake, or it was the biggest lake in East and West Africa. But since 1963, and this is research that completely boggles the mind, the lake has been reduced by 93%. And I was talking to a climatologist a couple of weeks ago who said, listen, that is one of the reasons why they're having an insurgency, because that lake used to provide food for people around there. People could go there, fish, sell their fish not only in their community, but move it to the rest of the countries. That is no longer happening. The governments cannot even afford to put anything else in place. So these people are frustrated, and when other people come with enticements like guns and a little bit of money and say, let's fight the government that is not doing anything for us, they pick up these guns. Now, this is not the only reason behind Boko Haram, but according to this climatologist, this is a major reason. And also in this region of West Africa that I'm talking about, the Sahara Desert is encroaching every single year across several countries in the size of where we are right now, Geneva. That's 4 or 5 countries that are being encroached upon the size of Geneva every single year. Now, if climate change is not a problem, then I'm not quite sure what is. I won't even go into the coronavirus pandemic, because we'll just go on and on. But yes, these are existential problems that we have, and I'm glad that they are problems that we're talking about now, and hopefully, governments will listen to the voices of the people, to the voices of these small island developing states, to the voices of the most vulnerable states, and to the voices of the global south. Sharon.
Peter, thank you so much for your perspective, greatly appreciated. And we want to thank all of our panelists who participated this morning, my end, afternoon, your end. That brings us to the end of Dialogue 2. However, we're expecting that the President of Kenya, His Excellency Uhuru Kenyatta, will be making a symbolic handover to Prime Minister Motley, and we hope to bring that to you shortly. The next dialogue is a dialogue on building a more prosperous development path, matching the scale of the moment, and we invite you to join us for that.
Thank you for joining us again for Dialogue 3 for this 15th quadrennial conference of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Our topic this time around is building a more prosperous development path, matching the scale of the moment. And I'm glad to say that we can now join my colleague Sharon Marshall in Barbados. Sharon, take it away.
Thank you so much, Peter. Before we get started on the Dialogue 3, we have an intermediary ceremony. As you would have heard at the opening ceremony, President of Kenya, His Excellency Uhuru Kenyatta, was not able to be in Barbados for the opening ceremony. However, he's here now and is making his way to the platform with Prime Minister Mia Mottley, and there's going to be a brief ceremony where he hands over. As you know, Kenya hosted UNCTAD 14 and assumed the presidency of UNCTAD. So, in a show of the official handover, President Kenyatta is here. He will make brief remarks, and then he will officially hand over to the incoming president of UNCTAD, Prime Minister Mia Mottley. So with that, I invite you, President Kenyatta, to give your opening remarks. And we have here with us the Secretary General of UNCTAD, Ms. Rebecca Greenspan, who is witnessing this ceremony. So welcome, sir. Welcome, ladies, once more. President Kenyatta.
Thank you. Thank you all very much, and let me begin first and foremost by saying how wonderful it would have been for me to join you all yesterday at the opening ceremony, but unfortunately due to other circumstances I was not able to do so. But today, Your Excellency Mia Mottley, Prime Minister of Barbados, our Secretary General, Rebecca Greenspan, all distinguished delegates here present or with us virtually, ladies and gentlemen, in July 2016, we as Kenya had the privilege of receiving the mantle from the state of Qatar to host UNCTAD 14 in Nairobi, a responsibility that we took with humility, commitment, and dedication to provide the most ideal environment in terms of technical and logistical support to all delegates, the UNCTAD Secretariat, and other stakeholders to enable them to deliver the expectations of the conference according to the agreed program of work. In Nairobi, we had two outcomes, namely the Nairobi Mafikiano and the Azimio, and these were the epitomes of devotion and determination by delegates to meet the expectations of the conference and to renew UNCTAD's mandate for the next 4 years. I once again commend the delegates for working tirelessly to produce an outcome that has supported UNCTAD's primary purpose of assisting developing countries to UNCTAD has remained steadfast in delivering on its mandate with the unwavering support of all its members. I want to, as I did yesterday, congratulate you, Ms. Rebecca Greenspan, for your appointment as the UNCTAD Secretary General, and I am indeed fully aware that you are taking over the leadership of this organization of ours at a time when the world is grappling with the unprecedented COVID-19 pandemic. But I do strongly believe that you will steer UNCTAD to the next level and contribute to a better recovery from this pandemic. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is now my privilege today to pass the mantle of hosting UNCTAD 15 to Barbados through Our Excellency the Prime Minister. And I do so well aware that UNCTAD 15 is taking place in extraordinary circumstances, which compelled most of us to hold our meetings virtually. But I say again that I am totally confident with Prime Minister Mottley's ability to take the task of leading the world through UNCTAD 15 to address all the complex developmental challenges, and I trust and believe that we are in very good hands. Her Excellency has demonstrated boldness and ambition for a better world order with a great vision. I congratulate you, my sister. And I wish you and Barbados the best as you host this 15th session and as you hold this 15th session and as you hold fort until the 16th session. Kenya, as always, stands ready and willing to support Barbados in whatever way we can to ensure that the conference is a success. So with those few remarks, it is now my pleasure to hand over the baton of UNCTAD 15 to my dear sister.
Thank you very much, my brother, President Kenyatta, and Secretary General Greenspan, Rebecca, my sister. It is a distinct pleasure on behalf of the government and people of Barbados, but also of the Caribbean community, to be able to accept this mantle and to take the responsibility for helping to guide, along with you, Rebecca, and your excellent staff, the functioning of UNCTAD with, of course, the countries of the world over the course of the next few years. We've already lost 1 year, but we accept that small countries normally have to work harder and faster. So we will make the destination of 2024, when this great organization celebrates its diamond anniversary, the 60th anniversary in 2024. I also accept this, conscious that I do so from a region that has already had a distinguished legacy in development. And I stand, therefore, not just on our shoulders here today with the issues that we have, but conscious that persons like Alistair McTair and Sir Srinath Ramphal, Lloyd Best, and George Beckford, and I can go on and on with the names that have become associated with development economics, not just in the Caribbean, but globally. And therefore, it is to this new generation to also show that we are as equal to the task at this particular juncture of the world's affairs, when so much seems to be going so wrong. We believe that the issues in many instances can be met by judicious policies and fairness and equity and opportunity. But we also recognize that, as easy as it is to say so, it is that much harder to persuade all of that. And to that extent, therefore, in the same way that this organization has done great work that eventually has come to be embraced as norms, that we hope that over the course of the next 3 years, we can, through the Bridgetown Covenant, as well as the Spirit of Speightstown, which is the political declaration, that we will be able to have an impact on the conduct of development and trade across the global community. And to that extent, therefore, I look forward to working with you. I'm happy that our sister, the Secretary General of CARICOM, is also here, because, as I said, we do this not just as Barbados, but as the Caribbean community, because our commitment to engage the world not as a singular territory, but as a community that has, in all respects, faced similar circumstances, trials and tribulations and opportunities. So thank you very much, and we look forward to working with all of you. And before I sit, I really want to thank not just the organizers in Barbados and Geneva, but the producers and everything, because the last 2 days are proven to be a ground breaker and a change in how things can be done globally for effective communication and conferences. And the hybrid approach, which allows us still to have a few to hug while having many to speak across the virtual atmosphere, is working well. I do not take it for granted how difficult and complex an exercise this is, and I really want to thank all of you, and Sharon, you and Peter in particular, for. Thank you very much.
The next dialogue. And we thank you for joining us for this brief ceremony. We'll take a short break and we'll be back with Dialogue 3.